بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Welcome to this new series. It's going to be inshallah a very informative series, and we're going to try and be as original as possible in this series. It's not a seerah which is going to be like a storytelling style. It's going to be a seerah where we're going to be trying to critically assess each of the claims, implicit or explicit, that are made by the seerah writers or by our tradition. So in other words, we're not going to come from a confessionary perspective. We're coming from a perspective of someone that is actually critical of the seerah. And that's why in the first lesson today, what we're going to go through is effectively the existence of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself. Because if you think about it, right, a lot of the new atheist or even skeptical, historical revisionist, orientalist type of narrative has been these religious stories. They're exactly just that. Religious stories, mythologies, fictions. They're useful fictions. And we don't need to believe in these things at all. So what we're going to be going through is, number one, how can we prove that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ even existed? What are the claims being made on the other side? Because we need to have an exposure of this. And the utility of that for us, for our purposes, is it will inshallah increase the yaqeen that we have, the certainty that we have of Islam. In fact, you'll find going through the slides that we're going to be going through today, inshallah, that there's such a rich, plethora of evidences relating to the historicity of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ of Islam, which would rival anything in the antiquity or Middle Ages, anything at all, not just religious information, but any information at all. So before we get started, let's maybe just do a critical introduction here, the first slide, and talk about something which a group of historians have come out in the 1970s, chief most among which was Patricia Crone and Michael Cook. And Crone, she wrote a book called Hagerism in the 1970s. And in this book, in the first instance, she actually was making the claim that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ doesn't exist. Why did she say this? I mean, this is a very radical claim, even for Orientalist standards, by the way. Like within the Orientalists, this is not a normal claim. It's a very, very radical claim. She said if you put, effectively, she was saying, if you put all of this kind of traditional narratives, the hadiths and the seerah and all this kind of stuff, if you put it to one side, okay, what are we actually left with? We're left with manuscripts, we're left with coins, we're left with, all these kinds of inscriptions, and it would seem to be that Islam was invented at least, 50 to 100 years afterwards, before the time that it was meant to be. So it's important to know the timelines here. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ died 11 AH. The Hijrah, there's a calendar, which, as we're going to cover, inshallah, it started with the migration from Mecca to Medina. Okay, so that's when the calendar started. So the Prophet ﷺ died 11 years after the Hijrah. And so that's why it's 11 AH. And this is commensurate with 632, a Gregorian calendar. So just bear in mind these two dates because they're going to be important when we're covering some of the slides today. So that's 11 AH, which is the same as 632. What Patricia Crone and Michael Cook and some of their students came out and said is that, look, actually, Islam really was invented afterwards. And she had this very elaborate theory about there being some kind of an alliance between Jewish people and Muslim people, and that Islam was actually an alliance. The Muslims and Jewish alliance tried to overtake Jerusalem, and in fact, these narratives were invented, and so on and so forth. Patricia Crone actually, because of certain manuscripts that came out, from my understanding, it was actually the Sana'a manuscript that changed her whole mind about this. She actually retracted her position. And so she does believe, even she, the most radical, skeptical mind, came to believe that actually the Prophet ﷺ does exist, and she retracted a lot of her earlier theories. Very interesting. So we're talking about, the forerunner of, historical revisionism in the West. So that's one thing. Really interesting. I was looking at some of the argumentations that she was making in her book, and she makes some interesting arguments, but it's interesting for our purposes because you'll see that actually this feeds into some of the confessionary narratives. She says, look, if you look at the Quran, you'll find it's not compatible with the historical context. So remember, from their perspective, the Prophet ﷺ, he wasn't a prophet. From their perspective, he wasn't revealed. No information was revealed to him from God. In fact, from their perspective, he's making this thing up himself. So she's saying, if you think about it, if you look at the Quran in Surah, for example, Al-A'raf, chapter 7, it's talking about Sabbath breaking. And this is meant to be a Meccan surah. Why is it in a Meccan surah, is it discussing things relating to Jewish people? There wasn't even a Jewish population there. So she's saying, like, it doesn't connect with the primary audience. And then she goes on to say, even agriculturally and contextually, like, you find that the references that are being made, yes, are of certain geographic features which are not available to, or were not applicable to the Prophet ﷺ's character or to his condition or context. For example, there's references which are more numerous and vivid, she says, to the sea. But in Arabia, there's not this kind of sea. She's saying, like, in the location, why is there so many references in the Quran to the sea? Moreover, why is the Quran talking about olives so much? Where we know for a fact, she says, Arabian Peninsula doesn't have olives. And it cannot even produce olives and pomegranates. Why does the Quran talk about these fruits? It wouldn't make sense if the Quran was context specific to talk about these fruits which the people, the primary audience, are not connecting with. But you can see how this can lend itself to an argument that we can make. Okay, from the confessionary side. So actually you're making the argument for us. Because it would indicate, I mean, obviously one could argue from the confessionary side or from the faithful side, this would indicate that the readership was not intended to only be the primary readership of the Quran. It's true. Why is it that would agree with Patricia? Say, look, it's true. You're right to say. Why is it that the Quran is talking about these fruits and these landscapes and these geographic locations which are not really applicable to the primary audience? It would indicate that the author of the Quran was intending this information for other than the primary audience, which is the Sahaba. So you see, it's an own goal, really. And you're going to see a lot of these own goals being committed by these skeptical minds. And that's why I think actually looking at these Orientalists and looking at these revisionists is actually quite useful. Because isn't it an irony that the more you make an argument against Islam, sometimes you find that these arguments themselves are the arguments for Islam. If you can really think about what you're saying here, right? So this is one thing. She says, look, for example, if you look at Surah Al-Kahf, chapter 18, verse 32, it's talking about, the man with the gardens. I'm sure you guys have read it and seen it. So the gardens, there's no greenery in Arabia. At that time, there wasn't. Now, there's more. And that's what prophecy, as maybe we'll cover, that the greening of the Arabian Peninsula. But at that time, there really wasn't. So why is the Quran speaking about gardens so much? And with good detail? As if the primary audience should connect with such information. It's true. Why is it? Because the Quran was intended, we would argue, right? So we continue. So some of her conclusions were the following. There was no caliph called Abu Bakr. Bear in mind this. I mean, you're going to find that this is a bit ludicrous. And that the Prophet ﷺ lived after 632. So he lived, he didn't die at 632. He continued living after 632. That the Prophet and Jews had this hyper alliance and attempted together to claim Jerusalem, as we've mentioned. And Mecca wasn't the center of Islamic civilization, but it was somewhere else, maybe north of the Arabian Peninsula. These are some of her conclusions. However, having said that, there is a plethora of evidences that we can use to our disposal. And even if we use her approach, and that's what I'm saying, let's use Patricia's approach and let's go with it for the sake of argument. And it's not just Patricia has come to this conclusion, this very unusual conclusion of there being no Abu Bakr or whatever. It's some of our followers or some people that are influenced by her. But even if we use this approach, let's put aside the hadith. You guys Muslims believe in the hadith. We're going to talk about the hadith. Well, you guys believe in the hadith. Let's put aside the hadith. We're only concerned with manuscripts, and we're not even concerned with the histories of the Arabs, which, by the way, frankly, is quite a racist and colonial thing. Because why should it be that we have to have like a white man to tell us what history was anyway? No, it's effectively that. That's what you're telling us. It's like, you know, we only accept histories from the Persians, or not even them. Let's be honest. Let's say the Romans. It's got to be from a Roman source. It's got to be another language. It cannot be the Arabic language. If it's that language, we know it's all, you know, conspiracy or confessionary or whatever, faithful. Or, and of course, if we did the same, if we flipped the switch on them and said, okay, let's do the same thing with the English. Henry V or Henry VIII or whatever it is, we're not going to accept any English sources. Let's just accept Gaelic sources or something like that. And let's see where we end up with your histories. Let's see what the white man's history is going to look like. We don't accept your own language history. But anyway, for the sake of argument, I'm going with it. We have the following sources to our disposal. The first one is the fragments of the Arab conquests. Now, this was actually, it was written 636 AD. Now, remember, we said that the Prophet ﷺ died when? 632. So when is this? 4 years after the Prophet ﷺ. Very, 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 very recent. Very close to the death of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And in it, not only is this a primary source, but it's a primary source with the name Muhammad in it in a different language. And this is what it says. Actually, it was the Battle of Yarmouk, which, funny enough, was the battle that who was engaged in? Who was the Khalifa at that time? Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. Yes? So this shows you another issue here. And the following was said, yes? In January, the people of Homs took, this is actually, this is a translation. It's been translated by, what's his name? Robert Holden, or I forget his surname now, but I'll come to it in a second. Who was a student of Patricia Crona, and he's seen as the top guy now. And he's written a book called Early Islamic History or something like that. And he translates these texts.
Is it Robert Hoyland?
Hoyland, yeah, that's right, Robert Hoyland. Yeah, so Robert Hoyland is a student of Patricia Crona, and he's translated this. I think he says the following. Well, the translation of it is following. In January, the people of Homs took the word for their lives, and many villages were ravaged by the killing of the Arabs of Muhammad. The Arabs of Muhammad is mentioned. Okay. And many people were slain and taken prisoner from Galilee as far as Beth. On the 26th of May, the such and such went from the vicinity of Homs, and the Roman chased them. On the 10th of August, the Romans fled from the vicinity of Damascus, and they were killed. Many people, some 10,000. And at the turn of the year, the Romans came. On the 12th of August in the year 947, they gathered in Gabitha is Yarmouk, by the way, a multitude of Romans, and many people of the Romans were killed, some 50,000. This is very, very interesting for more than one reason. Number one, it's actually commensurate with the Islamic report. Like, you know, the Battle of Yarmouk, as per our traditions, is exactly like this. And someone would be tempted to say, well, these Arabs, for example, they are exaggerating their histories. They're saying that they defeated the Romans and they did this and they did that. They're exaggerating their histories. But now you have a Roman source saying the same exact thing. And the key and critical point here is the Arabs of Muhammad. So much so that some of these Orientalists have been trying to say, look, it says Arabs of Muhammad, that gives you more credence that he was still alive at the time. But that's not necessarily so. There's nothing to indicate in that phraseology that he was still alive. But they were ascribed to him in one way or another. This is a key manuscript information which indicates without a shadow of a doubt that there was a man called Muhammad, that there were people fighting on behalf of his cause. And that the histories of the battles of Yarmouk, as per the Islamic tradition, are the same histories that you're finding in these traditions as well.
Hijab, is this written in the fragments of the Arab conquest?
Yeah, that's the one.
That's where it's written, yeah?
Yeah. So what this is actually, the actual fragment was in the Gospel of Mark. Funny enough, ironically enough, the Bible wasn't preserved, but the Bible is being used to preserve Islam. It's interesting, huh? The Gospel itself hasn't been preserved, but the falsified or unpreserved Gospels are being used to preserve Islam in another way, which is the Gospel of Mark. And all of this stuff is made because they used to have like these parchments and stuff like that, and it was written on there.